Awesome.
Okay,
Am I ready to go? Everyone ready?
fantastic. I'm good.
Awesome. My 7-minute speech will begin now. Hello, everyone. My name is Mercer Weiss, and I'm the first speaker on the government side of the following resolution. United States states should implement year-round schooling for K-12 education. In my speech, I'll first be going over the definitions, quite simple definitions, then going over our plan text, since we do acknowledge that the topic itself says should, which means that there should be a policy, and then go into our weigh mechanism, the way that the judges will be able to weigh the round, and finally, our three main advantages. Let's go straight into the definitions. And our first definition is year-round schooling. And year-round schooling is the practice of having students attend school without the traditional summer vacation, but instead more spread out breaks. So in the end, we see that schools themselves will be having the same number of days. It's just the breaks are going to be spread out differently. So it's based off of a year-round schooling instead of just having school, summer, and then school. We would also like to define K-12 education as public K-12 schools. We can all come to terms with this since this has to do with United States states. We can't mandate that private schools have year-round schooling, so we're looking at public education. Now let's get into our plan. Our plan is that by the next year-round school year, all United States states, in accordance with the Department of Education year-round guidelines, will implement a year-round schooling plan. We actually have identified that there's going to be no funding planned, or there's going to be no funding needed for a year-round school, because we do realize that the number of days is still consistent. The only thing that is changing is the schedule itself. And I'll explain later in my own advantages that the costs have actually reduced with year-round schooling, and that even with an increase in funding would actually not be needed at all. I'd also like to reiterate as well that since we are talking about United States states, they have to do it each on a federal level. So the Department of Education will be mandating this, and all states will have to abide by it and propose these guidelines for all public K-12 schools. So let's get into our weigh mechanism. And our weigh mechanism is essentially net benefits, who will provide the most amount of good for the most amount of people. And in this topic itself, we are looking at the most amount of students, and that is the most important. So before we go into our first advantage, I'd like to explain what this year-round school system looks like. So our year-round school system is broken up into 4 main quarters throughout the year, and these 4 main quarters are separated into quarter breaks, as well as the amount of school days in the quarter. For example, one quarter consists of 9 weeks. Then after the 9 weeks, it'll be given a 3-week break. And that is what a lot of schools have been doing, and that is what we're going to be following through with. Now, with that all being said, let's get straight into the case itself. Our first advantage, educational benefits. We see that right now in the status quo with a summer break, we see a lot of students losing the amount of information and material they learned in the previous year. We do acknowledge that since this is K-12 education, the knowledge that students are retaining is progressive, meaning that every single year they progress into the next grade level, meaning that all the information that they learn in their grade must be able to be kept and utilized once again in the next school year. For example, whatever I learned in 2nd grade must be applied again in 3rd grade, but also need to increase the number that I have, or the number of education that I received in 2nd grade to further my understanding. So let's see what happens during the summer. We see that during this 3-month break, we see a lot of students were forgetting their material. The routine is changed, and also the work ethic differs from before and after the summer. According to a national study done by the National Summer Learning Association, teachers have to spend around a month to review concepts from the previous year after summer vacation in order for students to catch up to the material that must be taught the subsequent year. This is very important because we also have found that according to the exact same study, we see that a lot of disadvantaged students, including minorities and students with disabilities, have seen a 20% decrease in the amount of information they retain from the summer going into the school year to the number of year-round schools that exist in the United States. Currently, there are 3,000 year-round schools in 46 states. So what we're doing with our plan is that we're mandating in all 50 states. Our solvency for this plan is going to make the breaks more efficient. Instead of having a summer break, we're going to have more efficient breaks because there will still be the same number of school days, except it's going to be broken up into quarters, and each intersession break will last 3 weeks. Since teachers will have to spend less time reviewing, which I've already explained how there are already benefits of students retaining the information from one break to the next, there will be less time spent on reviewing, which means there's going to be more time to spend on material and more projects, and also expanding the knowledge, which will increase the number and the amount that a lot of these students are retaining in the learning. We see that with more learning, there's going to be better retainment of knowledge, and lastly, an improvement in the quality of education. Since of course, more learning in students improves the quality of education. Our second advantage is the reduction of costs. In this status quo, there is a study done by La Cañada Unified School District that is one of the year-round schools, and they found reduced costs on a massive scale. They found reduced costs in utilities, transportation, supplies, equipment, reduced absenteeism, as well as a decrease in the number of vandalism that was occurring on campus. And this can also be reciprocated all throughout the United States in the 3,000 schools. Now, our solvency is only continuing this prospect. We see that we're seeing a decrease in costs, having to pay for utilities, air conditioning, transportation, supplies, and these all may seem like quite tedious things, but they all add up, and I'll explain the impact of this. We see that as decreasing the amount of cost that a lot of these schools have to pay, there's an increase in the amount of spending capabilities. With the increase in amount of spending capabilities and the budget that these schools have, we can see two other bigger impacts. We can first expand the number of class sizes, and second, have more supplies. Let's look at how improving the number of classes in a school will better the community. We see that there will be more possibilities of vocational schools for vocational classes for students to understand trade work, and a lot of schools will provide more classes that can lead students into a direct job. We'll see more teachers, and more teachers will be able to be a part of the schooling system, and more employment. And there also will be higher STEM access. With more classes, there'll be more opportunities. With also more supplies, we see more school technology, more money to spend for iPads and Chromebooks, a lot of schools that don't have it in the status quo, and overall improving the quality of education with more opportunities. And finally, with our third main advantage is individual prospects. In the status quo, year-round schools have seen better student-teacher relationships, higher consistency, lower burnout, as well as noticing the signs of mental illnesses and disorders, as well as stress levels have been decreasing. By increasing the quality of life for an individual, it becomes cyclical, because by increasing the quality of life for an individual in school, there's going to be more productiveness, they're likely to perform better and achieve higher in education, which will also improve their quality of life. Please vote on the government side, because our plan will benefit the education community. Thank you.
All right, hello. Once again, I'm April Mao from Campolindo, first neg, just confirming. And off-time roadmap, I'm going to be going over negation case first, and then onto the affirmations case for some weighing. All right. Is everyone ready? Cool. All right. If everyone's ready, my time begins now. So jumping right into it, onto the first contention, which is going to be about structural violence. So the first point here is that often a lot of kids from lower income families need summer jobs. For example, a lot of summer jobs are key to providing for like a lot of families where they like need someone else to work for them, which means that like once we make this year-round schooling for the whole entire like United States, that means a lot of low-income families are not going to be able to like have that like big 3-month break in order to go and earn money for their families, which is probably ultimately going to be bad. The second thing here is also because of like childcare. A lot of daycare centers do not provide childcare for like short like amounts of times that aren't like within the span of months. So this leaves a lot of families who are like struggling to find like childcare and daycare, and this is going to be really bad because that means a lot of parents have to stay home rather than go to work, which could cause a lot more other like financial problems for the family. The third thing here is also it can also increase the cost of education. I'll get to more detail later in my speech, but after 5 years of like mandatory year-round schools, the Los Angeles School Board actually scrapped this because it costs $4.2 million more per year in order to implement it, and the education returns were insignificant. Now, this is a really key study because this means that in one place where they actually implemented it, it didn't work, and it proved to actually have detrimental benefits. So that they actually scrapped it. The fourth thing here is that the quality of education is lower for racially diverse groups. So, like according to a report by ResearchGate, experimentation done to estimate the effect of rare year-round schools found that there was significant negative effects on academic achievements for like disadvantaged students, for all the like, and for a lot of like racial minorities. So the impacts here, number one, is poverty. So a lot of like children from low-income families are more likely to die at birth or in infancy than children born into richer families because they live in poverty. A lot of them, it drastically also increases chances for like chronic illness or like and other things. Like for example, for 10,000 children literally die daily due to poverty conditions. And the other thing here is also it's the internal link to education. So children and teens under the living under the poverty line are estimated to be 5 times behind by their affluent peers and literally receive a lower GPA. On to set the contention number two is education. So specifically, number one is having too many breaks actually makes it worse. So too many breaks can actually disrupt learning. So a Los Angeles school district evaluation found that based on the SAT like average scores, students that were on the year-round calendar were actually not as prepared for university level work as those that were on a traditional calendar. The study also reported more like student burnout for high school students on the year-round calendar, which proves that there's a lot of like detriment to this year-round calendar. And the second thing is also COVID. So COVID has already shaken up a lot of schools because of like this scenario. And now we're going to completely change everything. It's just bad on a time frame level. So the impacts here, number one, is that education is really key. Once again, cross-apply education is really key to like the jobs people can get, and the education is key to our like economy and having like innovation in the first place. And if we're harming that from harming the education for these students, it's probably a bad idea. Now, onto the third contention, which is going to be about schools in general and more about like school budgeting and stuff. So, number one here is that like school budgets and staffing issues may simply not allow for many schools to implement this extended school year programs. For example, many schools already struggle to pay teachers a competitive wage and can make it hard to like keep high quality teachers, and the cost of teaching as a full-time endeavor for year-round school may not be feasible for a lot of these schools. The second thing here is also maintenance costs, including like day-to-day keep up, and also specifically air conditioning and utilities. Now, this is really key because once we move to year-round school, students are going to be going to school more in the summer, which means that you, in a lot of areas, especially like the Midwest areas, it's really, really hot in the summer, and they really need air conditioning. In fact, this can cause the electricity bill for the schools to go jump up by more than 8%, which can be really, really well, although it may seem like a minor point, but it's actually really a big increase in utility bills because it's for literally 1/4 of the year, which could really, really hurt schools. And onto impacts. The impacts here is that we see that a study by the TCF saw that nearly 30 million school children will be impacted by this budget cost and also of year-round schools, which probably means that like schools that can't operate are going to probably shut down, which is probably not bad. So moving on to the affirmations case, so onto their plan. So they so a couple of refutations here. Just number one is that only looking at public education means that people who don't pay for fancy private schools are now going to be disadvantaged, and it's actually going to create a divide. So moving on to more specifically into their ad. So onto their first ad for response here. Number one is that we're going to say that 3 weeks have the same effects of summer breaks as well, because there's still breaks for students. So there's not actually any educational benefits. Number two is that like they talk about how students forget a lot of material and teachers have to spend like a lot of time reviewing it. We're going to tell that this is not really unique because people have to review stuff all the time. We are humans. We forget things. And the third response here is just cross-apply the stats that we tell you. We're going to tell you to buy our evidence more. Specifically, look to the SAT mean scores about how like the people on the year-round calendar were not as prepared. Look to the fact that according to a study by the Texas A&M Center for Business and Economic Analysis, there is actually no confirmation for empirical research that student learning retention actually increases under year-round education programs. All the studies that the affirmation tells you are not empirical enough because it's either too small of a sample or they're in areas where it's only like higher end people. So like a lot of their like statistics that the affirmation tells you is not a good representative of what it would look like throughout the country. The fourth response here is simply about preference. So in the status quo, there are year-round schools, and that's the specific difference between aff and neg, is that we in the status quo give students, if they want to, a choice of going to a year-round schools, which means those people who do not benefit from year-round schools can stay in the traditional school thing. But with the affirmations plan, now all of a sudden you force every single student into this year-round school thing, which can be really, really detrimental for a lot of students, which is probably wrong because different students learn in different ways. Moving on to their second point is about reduced costs and more opportunities. The response simply here is that the cross-apply from our evidence on our case about how there's actually going to be an increase in costs. Now, the things that the affirmation does not take into consideration is the fact that there are, like, in different areas, it's different because in different areas, they're going to need different, like, air conditionings. The weather is different. There's different costs in different areas, especially in the lower income areas where those costs will be driven up, which is going to be really detrimental for them. And also, according to educationweek.org, the potential economic cost of year-round schooling is a twofold, because the student can either suffer financially and the local businesses have to pay out for those jobs, or it's just going to be bad for the schools in general. So, like, even if there are a decrease in costs, it's still going to go up elsewhere. Thank you, Judge, and this is why negation should win today's debate.
All right, great. I'm just going to get a timer out really quickly. But while I do that, for a really brief off-time roadmap, I'm just going to be going over my negations, contentions, and then moving on into my own side at the end. So with that, is everyone ready? All right, time can begin now. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sophie Rivas-Plata, and I'm the second speaker on the affirmation side of today's debate. As I've already stated, I'm just going to jump right into my opponent's contentions. Starting off with their first contention, under this contention, my opponents talk about structural violence. Most of the points that they talk about in this contention have to do with summer jobs, childcare in the summer, and an example of when schooling on a year-round schedule did not work. So I have a few main responses for this contention. Under this, as Mercer and I were prepping for today's debate, we decided to look into a lot of the real-life instances of year-round calendar scheduling. As we've already stated, there are over 2 million students who are doing year-round school calendars. This is over 3,000 schools across 46 states. So we looked into some of the specific programs of these schools. We've been seeing that every year, more and more public schools are staying open during the summer. Most public schools already do stay open during this summer. The vast majority, according to Census Bureau, significantly over 50%, because of the fact that summer schooling does exist. Most public schools have to stay open to offer this option of summer schooling over the summer. And what this actually entails at the exact same time is that these schools continue to be open for the entire year. We've seen the status quo, considering the fact that most of the schools are open even during the summertime. This would not change the cost whatsoever, and teachers and advisors would still be able to be at a school system in order to provide childcare when necessary. We see that in the exact same when we look towards pay for teachers, it would not be changing at all with the year-round scheduling. Teachers who, for example, offered on summer schooling or who would stay at school to do childcare would still continue to be there during the breaks as they would in summer schooling. Nothing really changes, because the teachers and administrators that would stay on campus during summer in the traditional year calendar would continue to stay on campus in the exact same way under the full year-round scheduling. So childcare would still be offered. On top of this, my opponents have an issue with the summer jobs, but once again, jobs would still be able to be offered during the break times. These would be like 3-week breaks where students would be able to get job experience necessary. This would be still just as much commitment looking towards to be able to make this money. They'd still be able to make the exact same amount of money because they'd still be working for the exact same amount of time. The time between summer and these 3-week-long breaks in between the schedule would still add up to the exact same amount of days, which it would lead to directly students having no impact in regards to how much money they can make to help support their families, because really nothing is changing with the amount of time they have away from school. The amount of time is staying the exact same. It's just how the time is distributed is going to actually benefit the students significantly more than in the status quo. Under this contention, my opponent also brought up how it didn't work in this one instance in Los Angeles. But once again, as Mercer and I have stated, there are over 3,000 schools right now that are currently operating successfully under the year-round calendar system. My opponents have brought up one example when we've seen that this is already being implemented on a larger scale every year because of the benefits that it brings. Moving on into my opponent's second contention, talking about education. Under this, they talk about how there are more burnouts and how the breaks are actually worse. I have a few main issues with this contention. We actually use the same line of reasoning in our own third contention, talking about mental health for the individuals. Burnout is definitely a very serious part of a long stretch. For example, we're providing on the affirmation side students the exact same amount of school time, like time in the seats in classrooms. The only difference is that they would have more breaks more frequently. Instead of having to work in a very high and rigorous level for a long period of time, significantly more than we would in the year-round scheduling, my opponents would experience even more burnout in the status quo. We've seen that in a study from the National Summer Learning Institute, that that many of the teachers who are actually operating under the year-round calendar system for education has reported having less burnout for teachers and students, along with less stress levels and other things we've mentioned in our third contention. So with this, we see that this burnout, my opponents didn't really provide any reasoning as to why we would have more burnouts when we have evidence that says otherwise, and when they would just be having to work for a longer, more extensive period of time rather than having reasonable breaks when needed during their education. Next to the next point my opponents bring up is pay. They talk about how it would cost significantly more money due to things like air conditioning, due to teacher salaries and stuff like that. Once again, teacher salaries stay the exact same. The only thing that could potentially change is when they get their money, but the salaries would once again remain the exact same since none of the actual time is being changed. As well, my opponents are talking about how we're going to have to spend more money on things like air conditioning. Once again, most public schools are already open during the summer and have to continue having their air conditioning being run for childcare and for summer school purposes. So on top of this, moving on to another part of this pay argument, they talk about how we're going to be using up more resources, but Mercer and I looked into 5 examples of just randomly selected schools that have these that have the year-round calendar, and we've seen that from the switch between having the traditional calendar year to having the full year calendar, that there has been no changes with the amount of money that they are using every school year. So with this, I'll be moving on into my own case. Starting off with my first contention about educational benefits, my opponents talk about how it's not going to be beneficial because they'll still have just as many breaks. They'll still have an equal amount of breaks. But once again, it's important to keep in mind that not learning for 3 or 4 months at a time is very different than not learning for 3 weeks at a time, because this gives a much longer time for all of this knowledge to slip out, to forget about it, to get preoccupied with other things and not focusing on school at all. Well, we're just allowing for 3-week periods of students being able to have time to take a break, to be able to spend time with their families, to work a job if necessary, rather than having to go 3 months without learning at all. Obviously, the knowledge being lost in 3 months is going to be much more significant than knowledge being lost in 3 weeks. Under this contention, my opponents also said that the educational quality of year-round schooling is bad because the SAT scores have shown not to be too high. I don't really know exactly where their source for this one was coming from, or exactly how the study was conducted. But as we've seen in recent years, there has been a lot of people talking about the SAT and other standardized testing, and if it's even a good measure of education and quality of education. So I don't really think this point should be taken into account, considering the fact that so many people are pointing out so many of the issues of standardized testing as a whole and how it's not an accurate measurement of overall educational quality. The last point my opponents gave under this contention was how there's absolutely no choice, and how some people need a different educational environment. And we do understand this, but it's because we generally believe that the year-round schooling is more beneficial to all students. As we've already pointed out, disadvantaged students, which includes students with disabilities, ethnic minorities, low socioeconomic students, and second language learners, have been able to, how in the status quo, are losing their knowledge over the summer at a 27% increase than their regular peers. These these ethnic minorities and overall disadvantaged students are already suffering significantly more in my opponent's world. than they would be in the affirmation world. With this, the choice isn't necessary because we would actually be providing for all people, the privileged and those with significantly less privilege. On to our last contention, talking about mental health. My opponents completely dropped this point. They never once touched on the fact that better student-teacher relations lead to teachers being able to point out signs of mental illness and just overall struggling student. We see that on the affirmation side, we get the most amount of benefits for the vast majority of all students and teachers in the public education branch. Thank you.
Okay, so the order is just going to be starting on the negations case in the order it was read, and then going to the affirmations case in the order that it was read. Okay, anyone's not ready? My 8 minutes begins now. So starting off by talking about the negations first, contention of structural violence. First, I'm going to go over the refutations and then the drop points. So the first refutation that my opponent gives is that basically there are more schools staying open in the status quo right now. So basically their argument here is that we know that it's probably good because a lot more schools want it. Basically what they do here is that they just kind of give like the negation a bunch of solvency here, because if we know that it's a trend that more schools are going to go into this inevitably, then what is the point of the affirmation plan specifically? Ultimately, it's going to be better to do the negations, because not only does it give schools time to decide what's best for them, but it also accounts for the COVID points that my opponent specifically dropped, how it's going to be really, really bad to do this in such an unstable time and force every single school to do this. So if you buy what they tell you about more schools are doing this, you probably buy that it's better to vote for the negation in the first place. The next refutation that they give is they talk about how a lot of schools are operating at full capacity right now, so it wouldn't basically affect the cost. However, this isn't true because summer school is like very, very small compared to the capacity of actually operating like main schools. It's kind of just basic knowledge to reasoning to understand that specifically when you have summer school, you're probably not going to have the electricity on in as many rooms. You're not going to have anything at like up to full capacity. So it's still going to have all of those impacts. The next way that they try to respond to our childcare point is specifically saying that there are the same number of days off. However, the issue is not with the number of days off specifically, but that jobs do not hire in these sporadic 3-week boosts. Remember, jobs are mainly looking for these long-term workers who they know can be reliable. However, when we have students that can really only pop in for 3 weeks, they probably aren't going to get any jobs, and this goes unrefuted, which means that you should definitely buy this impact and all the structurally violent impacts it has for lower income people, because they often might need to support their families with a second job. However, what the affirmations plan does is it completely eliminates their ability to do this. So extend on this contention, basically childcare, which was unresponded to. Just to repeat a couple words for that, we see that daycare centers don't really provide this childcare for a short period of time. So basically this can cause financial problems for families when one parent has to stay home. And it's obviously going to be a lot worse for low-income families and lead to a lot of violence there. But also extend quality of education for diverse groups. Again, look to according to a report by ResearchGate, experimentation done to estimate the effort of year-round school calendars on nationalized tests performance of traditionally disadvantaged groups found that there were significant negative effects on their academic achievement. Regardless if you believe standardized tests are good or not, they are still a metric that is used to like determine, places that students can get into. So it's probably good if students are able to do well on them. So now moving on to our second contention. So the main point that my opponents bring up here is that they have more burnout specifically. However, we see that motivation is still decreasing after these 3-week breaks. We see that according to a study done by DUQ University, there was a motivation drop after spring breaks, which are usually the length, a couple weeks, is what the affirmation presents. So we see that there still is a problem with this burnout and this memory memory and motivation specifically, because those are weeks that you're not in school and still not getting that learning. So a couple things to extend on this contention is specifically the COVID point that goes dropped, right? COVID has already shaken up schools and now we're completely going to change everything. It's just specifically not a good idea because a lot of schools aren't functioning at their best right now, and students are really tired of all of this change, which can lead to even more burnout. Again, and extend our aptitude test from Los Angeles, basically how year-round students were much lower. So moving on to the third contention about schools, they basically talk about how teachers' salaries are specifically going to stay the same. However, if you look at the evidence that we give you, we see that there's just a lot of issues with budgeting, right? So if students have to, if the school has to pay a lot more for this air conditioning, for utility bills, then they're probably going to cut off teachers' salaries. And many schools already struggle to pay teachers a competitive wage, which is going to be really, really bad. And I have more warrants that my partner gave out as refutations for their case that I'm going to go over later. But for now, just extend what we tell you about how this can be up to 8 an 8% increase in utility bills in the summer, and how obviously having schools operate in the summer is probably going to be really, really bad because they have to pay that extra 8% in already expensive utility bills. Not only that, but extend our third point on contention 3 about how extracurriculars are harmed, because it's really, really difficult to build a strong team when you're taking a 3-week break in the middle of every semester, right? And so when you have this, this basically means that students are getting a very little and like a less extracurricular and enriching extracurricular experience that might help them with college applications, might also help them just have like a fun time and better mental health in high school and K-12 just in general. So I'm going to move on to the affirmatives case. So first on their first advantage about educational benefits. So the first is that we give like a lot of sources specifically about why there really aren't that many educational benefits to having these year-round schools. Like, not only do we give you reasoning as to why these 3-week breaks are going to have the same effect as summer breaks, but we also give you like warrantation from A&M University as to why there's no empirical research about conclusive empirical research about how this is actually going to help. And we see that like time and time again, students are less prepared for college when they take like these aptitude tests, and they're doing worse on these standardized scores. Even if you buy that these standardized scores are a bad metric, a lot of schools still specifically use them. This is another reason to vote for the negation when you think about that we are just doing the same thing but longer if you buy their status quo claims, because if schools are going to move away from these test scores, that's probably going to take longer. So that's just another reason that the status quo is going to solve. So the next thing is, this is actually going to be when students have to basically review and update themselves on the procedures every year. This is probably going to be better for the students' real-world skills. Now, this is specifically because they have to learn how to adapt and how to retain things. Again, not everything is just going to be like handed to them on a silver platter specifically like that. So it means that it's better for students to actually learn how to adapt and learn how to retain things when there are breaks, because it's a really, really important life skill. And then the my third point on the first advantage is just basically extend what we tell you about preference. If students and family want a year-round school, they can petition to their school, they can find other ones in their community. However, if you mandate this for all states, this means that students who are specifically different, who maybe don't want this year-round schooling because of issues that it might not work for them, then we should be able to give them that choice, and we shouldn't be specifically like mandating and controlling their education so much. The bottom line is choice is going to be the best thing for these students, because every student is different. So now talking about their second advantage. So just a couple things. So again, look to the fact that all these economic costs are still going to happen. According to educationweek.org, the potential economic cost of year-round schooling is twofold, because the individual students may suffer financially, as well as local businesses, because they have to pay out more for jobs that may be better suited for high school students who don't have the time off now to work for them, because they only have these 3-week breaks. Now, this affects like individuals in terms of their like economic status and poverty, but it also affects these like businesses that are around them, leading to really, really big economic impacts in the entire community. So that proves that there are like just really, really large and really, really bad economic impacts. And really, really bad economic impacts for all of this when we have these year-round schools. Overall, we give you a lot of reasoning and evidence specifically as why the benefits, and the very, really small benefits that rarely do anything for education, really aren't worth all of this that's really going to ensue because of the bad things that are happening with this year-round school. Again, we don't really see a significant increase in students' performance on aptitude tests. We don't see a significant increase in their abilities to be ready for college and also participate in extracurriculars, which basically means that they aren't going to be able to get into good colleges, and they aren't going to be able to really have a good high school experience as well when they don't have extracurriculars. So therefore, it's going to be really, really bad, and ultimately, we should let students and their families have a choice between what is best for them, and it should not be a thing that the government mandates. Thank you, and that's why I encourage a vote for the negation.
All right, hello. It's just going to be for the offhand roadmap. It's just going to be weighing. So I recommend pulling out a separate sheet for the judges for you to just write down my weighing, because I'm just going to do a really clear like bunch of points. So I'm not really going on specifics on the flow. I'm going to extend a few things on the flow, but other than that, it's mostly just going to be like a separate sheet, or at least I recommend a separate sheet. Up to you, obviously. But yeah. If everyone is ready, then my time begins now. So jumping right into it, you're going to be ultimately voting for negation today, specifically because of structural violence. So let's move on to why structural violence comes first. So structural violence comes first for two reasons. Number one is because of advocacy skills. It helps us have the ability to engage in a lot of like proximal instances of violence, and a lot of people can use these local understandings of violence in order to be advocates and actually be able to do things in the real world. So the second reason is also because structural violence is the most real and most probable impact that we 100% know is happening, because we can see it crossed by the 10,000 children that literally die every day because of poverty, crossed by the children who aren't able to get education because they are in poverty. We see the people dying, and education is just simply so important. Now, moving on, let's see why the negation is winning on structural violence. So specifically, a couple of reasons why negation is winning on structural violence. Number one is that affirmation concedes concedes the first contention about the jobs. It's just common sense. My partner and I tell you multiple times that no workplace hires people for only 3 weeks, especially students. No workplace is going to hire only students for 3 weeks. And this is going to have a really, really large impact on the thousands of families who actually need their students to work and rely on their students working in order to get by in life, which means that you're going to ultimately be like ruining the lives for like thousands of families. The second reason why we're winning on structural violence is because you extend the 8% increase in costs and the $4.2 million per year that was used. These are real empirics. These are actual stats and maintenance bills that people tend to ignore, that can be disastrous for especially low-income schools, because now they have even more costs, and this is going to be horrible for being able to run the school, and some schools are going to even have to shut down. I give you examples of this in my speech. Don't let the affirmation come up here and just be like, oh, blanket statement, and be like, oh, well, there isn't that many costs. This study showed that there isn't that many costs, because when you really implement it, the real statistics are that there will be costs, especially for low-income schools. The third reason why we're winning on structural violence is also because of COVID. A lot of people are already feeling the impacts, especially low-income people are feeling the impacts of COVID, the impacts of like online school, and also low-income schools are having it the worst during this time. This is also a time frame issue as well, because basically affirmation is saying we should be changing right now. That's a horrible, horrible time. This is probably the worst time to shift into year-round schools, because things are already so hectic, which means that not only is COVID a structural violence issue, but it's also a time frame issue for you to vote against the affirmation. The fourth reason why the negation wins on structural violence is because we proved to you that a lot of students don't learn well with this. In real empirical studies, that we showed that standardized testings were lower. So we showed that test scores were lower, GPA score, were all lower, which means that real empirics are there. The last thing is that there's this one drop warrant that the affirmation does not, that affirmation concedes, which is that in a study by A&M, they should prove that there's no empiric research that showed that year-round education actually improved education, because the research that showed that it quote-unquote improved education were in higher income areas, where obviously it's going to show that it increases education. So you're just simply not going to buy any of those stats that they do say. The affirmation completely concedes this. Now, just on for some final preempts, don't let them say that standardized tests are bad, because they matter to colleges right now, and it's actually even more proof why we shouldn't switch right now. Don't let them say that we don't have enough evidence. We literally give you the most amount of evidence in today's round. Ultimately, you're going to be voting for negation, because we proved to you that structural violence is the biggest impact in today's round, and we win on structural violence. Thank you, Judge, and this is why negation should win today's debate.
All right, before I begin my final speech, I'm just going to give a brief off-time roadmap, if that's okay with everyone. Okay, awesome. I'm going to start off with just two main voter issues, then with some weighing in both of them, then a world versus world comparison, and lastly, a case by case, just analyzing what was dropped in the round. All right, is everyone ready? Okay, I'd like to begin my 5-minute speech now. So let's dive right into the voter issues to explain why, at the end of the round, the government side has won. We look at the main voter issue, and that is who best improves the quality of the education. We see on the opposition side, they bring up three main arguments who support this idea. They talk about avoiding structural violence, they talk about preventing disadvantaged students and education, and they also mention less breaks. But I'd like to bring up the extensive refutations that our own side brought up, and as well as what the government still has strong in the round. We see, first of all, about structural violence. We already talked about, my second speaker refuted this argument by saying childcare still exists. If anything, there will be more childcare because it'll still exist over the summer, which is very crucial. Childcare is essential and it needs to be consistent. And we talked about consistency at the beginning of my case in my third advantage, but also in the refutation my second speaker brought up. We also talked about avoiding structural violence by noticing the signs. In my third advantage, which goes unrefuted about mental health, we are talking about noticing the signs. By having more consistency in school, we see that teachers are going to be able to notice signs more often because students are going to be showing up more often. The breaks are shorter, but it's going to be more spread out so that the teachers will be able to notice the signs and notice the signs of structural violence. That is a very important point and a very important refutation that still goes and still stands at the end of the round. We also talk about how the jobs will still be available because we know historically that jobs with students are flexible. That's the whole point of having a summer job. Jobs are supposed to be flexible for students. They're supposed to adapt for students. Jobs will have long-term employees, but then they'll also have student employees. I already mentioned also with the 3,000 schools in 46 states, there are students who are still working in those 3,000 schools in 46 states. That includes 2 million students across the United States. So we can see that this flexibility will still consist. And lastly, they talked about less breaks, and they said how all of these breaks will be conflicting, and they talked about the SAT, and they said the government cannot mention any refutation to the SAT. I'd like to mention and go back to what I brought up in my first advantage. According to the National Summer Learning Association, they talked about how disadvantaged students were learning about 27% less and retaining 27% less information than year-round schools. That is on a holistic level. That is science, math, English, reading comprehension, all of the subjects in school, and not just the SAT, which is evidence-based reading and some algebra. The SAT is not a holistic measurement judge. So you're going to be voting on the government for the quality of education because we tell you that there's going to be learning improvements. And this argument is essentially conceded because we do have facts to prove that there are going to be learning improvements and there's going to be less time spent on review. Remember at the beginning of my first advantage in my first speech, there won't be that month spent by teachers to review concepts. We will also be reducing costs on all aspects. And they only refuted by saying, oh, well, they might have to pay more for air conditioning. We bring up the La Cañada example from the school district. And lastly, in our third main argument for the quality of education, we said there's going to be increasing teacher opportunities, and we see that they're going to be increasing teacher opportunities by expanding the number of classes. And they responded to this with this assumption and saying how all school districts have poor budget cuts. But judges, we need to realize that La Cañada and the thousands of other examples have actually improved the number of teachers that are in their school and the number of classes. So at the end, with net benefits, and we're going to analyze this through an impact calculus of magnitude. On the opposition side, they're essentially advocating for the status quo, which is going to be a worse magnitude. They see 27% of low-income students will be falling behind, and they'll still be spending months to review concepts. On the government, we're going to have a very high positive magnitude because all students and teachers in 50 states will experience the effects of improving learning access and supplies. When we look at our second main voter issue of who best improves the quality of individual prospects for the individual students, the opposition really only brings up two main arguments. That means that there's going to be more burnout because of the, how consistent the school is, and also talking about how teachers will be paid less. The more burnout argument doesn't essentially work because they assume that with the school days being rearranged, there'll be more burnout. But I brought up in my third advantage about the individual prospects, how the consistency actually resulted in less burnout, because on the individual level, we see that teachers and students will have better relations, and we'll see that teachers will be having more jobs. So there will be less teacher burnout, as well as for students, because there will be less mental health issues. Burnout is associated with stress levels. With less stress levels, there's going to be less burnout, and that is so crucial in year-round schooling. So in the end, when you look at the case by case, you see that our first advantage, our disadvantage argument and evidence still stands, and our second advantage, they're ignoring the real-life situations that are presented. And lastly, we can see that the advantage 3 still remains quite unrefuted. We win on net benefits because we give real-life examples to show how education will expand holistically with year-round schooling. And in their world, they want to have more motivation, better quality of education. They want to be able to bounce back from COVID-19. But if you want to actually do that, propose a policy that will present the greatest amount of good for students and teachers. That is the affirmation, providing a plan that solves for the issues in the status quo. Do not just concede to structural violence and do nothing about it. Vote for the Gov. Thank you.
Akshanan, do you wanna start?
For sure. So I ended up voting in favor of the opposition. this was a great round and also one that was very hard to decide. I think kind of throughout the round, there's a lot of kind of overlap in terms of, both teams are making arguments as to why there's like burnout or it affects low income students more, etc. And I think one thing that would have helped my decision a lot is kind of a little bit more of evidence analysis. I understand that that's obviously extremely difficult, and partly when you have a short prep time, you don't have each other's cards. But I think in particular, making reasons as to why maybe one empirical example or a kind of case study over many examples would be preferred, is going as to which one of those kind of methodologies for studies would be preferred. I think sort of things like that would go a long way. Kind of resolving through the voting issues at the end of the round. One thing I'll note is I found the organization of the AF's last speech a little bit difficult to flow because of a lack of signposting. So I would highly recommend that, because I think that there's a chance that you were saying things that I was missing. But I think it was a little bit unclear in terms of where you were addressing things, because I sort of just ended up flowing it in a big list as opposed to kind of organizing it flow by flow. But I think that in particular on the fifth voting issue from the negative on the A&M study, I have an extension that kind of in places where full year schooling is beneficial, it only works in high income areas. Insofar as both teams are kind of mutually agreeing that structural violence is going to be the weighing mechanism through the round, I think that absent a sufficient response as to why things like better mental health, less burnout, etc., is really only happening in higher income areas, whereas lower income areas are going to struggle to things like potential budget cuts, etc. Absent a great response to that, I think that it's kind of an uphill battle for the AF within the context of structural violence. In terms of some other specifics for the neg, in the COVID argument, I thought that had there been an extension of status quo solves, was made in the second constructive, this would have been also a really compelling argument for me. But absent an extension of that in the final speech or any articulation, I think that the time frame argument is a lot less persuasive, because there's no clear articulation of why it gets solved later on, why the timing is kind of key. And then in particular for the AF, I think that signposting in the last speech would have helped out a lot, because I'm sure that there were some sort of organizational issues that or things that you said that just probably got placed in the wrong spot and could have impacted my decision. But in particular, I did really like the try or die framing, and I think that that was sort of the right move, saying in the status quo, things are pretty bad, so we can't just turn a blind eye. I also think that on childcare, you probably could have turned it, because that's probably a pretty high cost for families in the summer for long periods, and so less long breaks. Although less long breaks would probably save money. But yeah, in particular, just a big issue for me was the organization in the last speech.
Got it. So we've got a split decision here. My decision was actually for Gov. In this case, I thought you guys all did a fantastic job. So one, congratulations. I think this is a great debate for us to watch as judges, which I think is fantastic. And in some sense, I'm actually glad that it was a split decision, because I think it reflects that both teams, I think, did really well in this debate. I think ultimately, I think that some of the arguments came down to evidence assertion clashes, which at least from my standpoint, I just kind of let be a wash, because I'm not a walking Rolodex that can kind of fact check everything. But I think that one of the challenges with this debate was that it ended up getting a little bit too focused on certain assertions in places. And I thought that there were certain arguments that I think did have some more legs beyond just factual assumptions about numbers or citing a study, and were fleshed out a little bit more. And while it was a very close debate, I actually thought that the government side did a little bit of a better job fleshing out some arguments to impact without just sole reliance on factual data. I think one of the things that was persuasive to me was the idea, even if we discount some of the statistics that were cited about retention of knowledge that's lost over summers, I think that was important. And I think one thing that was maybe a question that was in my mind throughout this whole debate was it seemed highly focused on high school students. But this is K-12, right? And so there are a lot of students who are not working. And so some of the arguments about childcare become much more pertinent, when you're talking about someone in first or second grade versus someone who's in high school who's maybe more or less sufficient and may be able to meaningfully earn for their families. I also felt that some of the arguments, just staying in tune with folks' mental health was an interesting argument, because I think it actually can play to both sides of this argument. But I thought it was one of the arguments I think both sides of this debate, I think, engaged with in a way that was not just about, okay, here's some factual number, like here's like some of the systematic differences between structuring a school year in these two different ways. And so I really appreciated that from both sides of the debate. One thing that I was not sure of, and I think is maybe just good future learning for future rounds for everyone here, is how do you make an argument such that it is not ending at the factual assertion and then warrant? I think that's kind of where I saw most of the arguments in this debate go. You guys made evidentiary assertion would kind of give me some warrant for like why I should care about it, but I was lacking the last piece of like, what is the impact, the so what? Why do I care as a judge, and like why is this ultimately the issue that should carry the day? As an example here, I feel like the concept around short breaks versus longer breaks, I feel like there were a lot of different assertions made in this round. And I can think of plenty of things, that maybe would have been interesting with regard to family dynamics, about like how it may or not be easier to cover shorter periods of time, or it's easier to take periodic breaks from work than it would be to like cover a 3-month time span, was one thing. The other thing too is like kids get into trouble, right, when they're given a lot of time to just kind of let themselves do whatever they want. Not everyone can afford to do summer school or go to summer camp or whatever else. And so I thought that was another interesting area that I felt like could have been explored more by both sides in this debate. I think both sides kind of touched on the extracurricular aspect of school, and how changing ourselves to a full year schedule might change that. But I would have liked to have seen a little bit more argument from both sides on that. And then I guess one last question, I guess for all of you guys just to ponder, is I think there were a lot of questions about workplace. And I think that that's a really interesting question. I think both sides, I think, engaged in this, but I think ultimately I found myself leaning a little bit more towards Gov, that like employers will be willing to be flexible in finding ways to accommodate students, I think, for many reasons. And I think some of the things that could have been impacted more would have been areas where, at the end of the day, student labor is relatively cheap labor relative to a full-time workforce. And so that is something that is an incentive for employers to take advantage of, both in terms of their finances, but also to offer opportunities to students. And I think something that, on the ops side, I think you probably could have talked about is how not being able to engage in, not just from like an economic standpoint, being able to earn money, but like, are you going to get meaningful experience from having these short breaks, right? Like how meaningful of a like summer internship are you going to really be able to have in 3 or 4 weeks if it takes you 2 to 3 weeks to, get onboarded and learn like how things work? I would have loved to like hear a little bit more about that from both sides of the debate, because I think either side really could have won that argument to me. And I guess in this case, it was just a very close debate, and I found slight things that I found slightly more persuasive by government, but by no means was this like a wide open debate for me to judge.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, judges, and good job, guys.
Yeah, thank you so
Yeah,
much.
so
Good luck.
good luck, everyone.
Thank you.